Welcome back. This is the part that gets really exciting. You can use JavaScript to listen to events and act based on what the user does. Now, what do I mean by events? Events are things like clicking, mouse entering or hovering over something, or user trying something in a search bar. So we can listen to these events and react to them using JavaScript. Let me show you how. We have our old shopping list from the previous video, and if I add a button here, and we'll just say click me, save and refresh, we have the click me button. I've also created a script.js file here in the same folder as index.html, and we obviously want to add it, so we'll do it right at the bottom as we've mentioned in previous videos, and we can include it by referencing it through the source, and we'll call it script.js to reference the name on the script. Let's save. Now, learning what we've learned, we can select this click button. Let's test this out. If we want to select the button, I can say document.getElement by tag name, and we'll say button. So that selects the button for us. Okay, so how can we listen to the fact that a user can click this button? Well, we have something called events. And what these are, and I'll link to the reference here, is there are a whole bunch of events that a web browser allows us to listen to. So if you look over here, we have mouse events like mouse move, mouse over, click, double click. We have key press, and a whole bunch of other events. But the most common ones, and the ones that you'll see 90% of the time, are mouse events and keyboard events. So if we look over here, we have a click. So we can listen for a click. How can we do that? Well, in my script file, I'm going to say document, or let's call it button equals document.getElements by tag name, and we'll select the button. Now that we have the reference to the button, I can now say button.add event listener. And this is a method that we can use, and it accepts two parameters. The first one is the event. In our case, we're listening to the click event. And the second parameter is the function, or what we want to do based on the click. So in our case, we can just say console.log click. So we're saying add an event listener to this button that we've selected. Whenever the user clicks, I want you to run this function. And this function is to console log click. Let's see if that works. And refresh, and we see that we have button add event listener is not a function. And that is because, remember, get elements by tag name returns an array of buttons. So if we copy and paste this, we see that in order to access the button, we have to go 0 to access the first element in the array. So that's a very common mistake that people make. So make sure that if you get this error, that's probably because you're trying to use a method on an array and you need to use that method on the actual element. Okay, let me close that and fix this to say the first button. Perfect. I'm going to save, make that a little bit smaller so you can see, and refresh. And I'm going to open up the console and let's see what happens when I click. Click, 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 click. Okay, so it's working. We're listening to the click event. Very, very cool. I can also listen to something like mouse enter. another E over here and refresh. You can see over here that as soon as I do mouse enter, it registers the event. You can also do mouse leave, refresh, and every time I leave, I get that event. Very cool. So there's a ton of them. I will link to this so you can check it out yourself. But like I said, keyboard events and mouse events is what you would like to look at. So looking at this list, I think we can improve it. I think we should have an input and a button where we can type in something and add to the shopping list. So let's try and do that. I'm going to erase this code and I'm going to save and refresh. And we're also going to change a few things here. Instead of click me, the button, we want to say enter. And we'll give this button a class of enter. And we also need an input. So I'm going to remove this p tag. And instead of the no excuses, I'm going to say input type text. If you remember, that's the default. And we can also add an attribute, placeholder, enter items. So now if I save and refresh, look at that. I have a placeholder and I can type in whatever I want. But right now, they don't really do anything. Ideally, when we click enter, it gets added to the bottom of the list. So how can we do that? First, we're going to need to select these items. So the one thing I really like doing is making sure that we have good class names or IDs for these elements so that we can grab them easily. So we definitely want to grab the button, which has a class of enter. But I actually like using ID because it'll be really, really fast for the web browser to grab an ID because there's only one of them. Performance-wise, although it's very, very minuscule, it does help. So I'm going to change that to ID of enter. And we also want to grab the user input. So we can give it an ID of user input. Now let's open up our script.js file and think about the two things that we want to select. We want to select the input and the button. So we can do that by assigning them to a variable, document.get element by ID. And here we can just say enter. Remember, we assigned that ID. And input will be document.get element by ID. And we'll do user input here. And we want to add an event listener to the button. So let's do that. I'm going to say button.add event listener. We want to listen to the click event. And we want to perform the action, the function. For now, before we get into the actual code, it's always good to test what we've written so far. So we're just going to do console.log. Click is working. Let's save, open up the console, and refresh. And if I click is working. All right, everything's looking good so far. Ideally, we can enter something here, and when I click enter, it gets added to the bottom of the list. How can we do that? Let's think about this. The first thing we want to do is we need to create another li element. So whatever we enter should be added to the bottom of candles. We can use something called a create element method. So we can do variable li equals document.create element. Again, another method that document gives us. And in here, we just tell it which element we want to create. In our case, it'll be a list, an li. Okay. Now, this li we've just created that lives in this variable, we want to attach it to the bottom of the list. again, the document object gives us something called append child. So if I do li.append child, now in here, in order to append a child, if we remember our old diagram of the DOM, we see that each element has a text, what we call note. So we need to add a text note. Let's do that. Here, we'll have to do something called document create text node. And in here, we can just say testing. So now we've attached testing to the li that we've just created. Again, going back to our diagram, I've created an li element and I've added the text of test. So the last thing we need to do is to attach this to the unordered list. Right now, what we've done is we've created an li that says testing, but this is actually not attached to anything. It just lives in our program, but we need to attach it to the unordered list. And the way we do that is, well, we grab the unordered list and then append to it. So again, we're going to select unordered list, document dot query selector, and we'll select UL. And now we can say, I want to append. So append a child to UL, that is li, what we just created. So let's see that in action. I'm going to save and refresh. I'm going to close the console and I'm going to press enter. Look at that. It's working. Let me refresh that again. There you go. So this is working and we've learned a few new things here. One is that we can create an element. So we just give it the tag that we want to create. But this element needs to, well, if you want to display something, it needs to have some sort of a text inside it. So that is this over here. And the way that the document object model works is that in order to create a text, you do create text node and put whatever you want inside of it. Now, we've created this li, but we need to attach it to something that is part of the actual view right now. In our case, we want to attach it to the unordered list and use append child, which adds it as a child. These three are quite useful, so you'll just have to practice them and remember them. But we have something working here, which is good. But ideally, we can put something that we enter in here, not just a static testing. So how can we do that? We have the input already grabbed, and the way we get the value from an input is input dot, oh, we don't need the brackets anymore, it's input dot value. And we can just test it out over here, console.log. I've got to refresh. If I click enter, I get hello. And it should also be attached to the bottom over here. Okay, so we have a basic to-do list. We can enter stuff and click enter. But what happens if it's empty? And I click enter. Look at that. Do you see that? Just keeps adding stuff on. Ideally, we can skip that. If the input is empty, well, enter shouldn't do anything. The way we do that, well, it sounds like a conditional statement might be useful here. We can do if input.value is, well, what can we do here to test? If you remember, we have length property on strings. the length property tells us how many characters a string has. So we can do something along those lines to say if input value dot length is greater than 0, then we will move this in here. Otherwise we don't really need to do anything. We'll just let that click event happen without any actions. Okay, so let's see that in action. I'm going to save and refresh, and I'll do nothing and press enter. Nothing, press enter. Nope. But if I type something, it adds it to the list. But here's another problem. I can just keep adding these forever. Ideally, after I enter something, it all clears up. So let me refresh. And here, what can we do at the end of all of this? Where we can say input.value equals an empty string. After we create the new li and add it to the unordered list, I want the input value to now be completely empty, an empty string. Let's save and refresh. Let's try that. Hello? Click enter. And look at that. Now I have to type something new again. All right, things are starting to look nicer, but it's kind of annoying that I have to keep clicking. It would be nice to just also be able to press enter, right? Again, if we look at the events, we also have keyboard events. And key press, well, as the name suggests, listens to some sort of a key press. And luckily for us, we can just listen for the enter key or the return key. Now, how do we do that? Well, let's give it a try first. Let's just copy and paste this. And this time on the input, I'm going to say, instead of the click event, I'm going to say key press. So we're listening for the key press event. And we want to do the exact same thing that we've been doing. So that works. So how do we know when the enter key is pressed? Well, we have something called character codes. And that is, we can listen to which key was typed, and each one is associated with a code, with a number. So this website, again, which I'll link to, I can just press for a key here and it'll tell me exactly what code it has. So if I press enter, I get key code 13. So we're listening for key code 13. But again, how do we access that? If I open up the console here, I'll show you that the way we do it is that we listen to something called event.which. And I'm going to console log this. Now in here, and I'm going to comment this out for now so you can see. Every time an event listener is added, we have the key press, and this function also receives a parameter automatically that is the event. So we can call it E, we can call it event. In my case, I'll call it event. And now, when the user presses a key, it gives this function an event of the description of that event that happened. Actually, let's just console log the event and see what it is. I'm going to refresh and say key press. And you see that I have the keyboard event. And here, I get a whole bunch of information about the event that I just did. I even get the time when I press the key. But the thing that's really important here is we see that there's key code. And there's also which, both of them 107. If I press enter, we see that the key code is 13, which is 13. Let's give it a go. I'm going to say now that if input value is greater than 0 and event.keycode equals 13, then add the item to the list. Let's save and refresh, give that a go. I'm going to say shopping lists will need pens. I press enter. Look at that. And let's do yo-yo. Adds it to the list. Awesome. Everything looks good, but there's one issue that I'm having here. And that is, we have a lot of repeated code. This seems really unnecessary. And as I said before, one of the principles with being a developer is dry, which stands for do not repeat yourself. This is not very extensible, is it? It looks like we're just copy and pasting code. And imagine if we had a bunch of events, this will just be a massive file. So let's extract some of this logic out and show you how we can do something called refactoring, which is making code look a little bit better. One thing we can do is that it looks like in our if statement, we're doing the same thing, which is checking that the input value length is greater than 0. So we can add a function here called input length. And as the name suggests, this checks for input.value.length. But remember, as a function, we need to return something. Otherwise, well, we're going to run this function and it's going to say undefined. And undefined cannot, well, undefined greater than 0, that doesn't make sense. So return the length. So now, again, we've extracted that out so we can just say input length, run that function. Whatever it returns, is it greater than 0? And we'll do the same over here as well. Now that is a minor change, but now we have something that we can use everywhere. Anytime we create a new event listener. What else can we clean up? It looks like this whole block of code is being repeated here. So again, we can call function create list element. Here, we can just remove this code, add it here, and now we can just say create list element. And again, remove this and say create list element. Let's just save and see how everything works right now. I'm going to refresh, make sure the console doesn't give me any errors, and I'm going to say shells. And if I press enter, everything still works. And in case everything's empty, I can't add anything. All right, the code's looking nice. It reads pretty well. The last thing maybe I want to do is, instead of having the function here, I can extract that out as well. I can say function add list after click. And we can just say copy this function out and add it into here. And we don't need this function anymore. And now we can just say add list after click. And we can also have function add list after key press. And here's the tricky part. Now we have to copy this. But before I delete this function, you see that we need to receive an event with this. So it has to receive a parameter because we need that information from the event. So again, we pass it event, remove this function, and we have event.keycode. Let's see if everything works as expected. I'm going to save, refresh, see if there's any errors in the console, and press water, adds water, juice, adds juice, and if I don't press anything or don't enter anything, it still works. Let's look at this code one more time and see what's happening. We started off with selecting the elements that we're interested in. And notice here that we're not constantly, every time we need them, saying document get element by ID. We're caching this. So at the beginning, when the script runs, we're saying, hey, remember this, I'm going to use it, and store it in button. And same with the input, same with the unordered list. We then have a bunch of function declarations, but these are never run because they're just saying, hey, we have this function, but nobody has run them yet. And the program goes to the bottom and says, hey, add an event listener for click. If anybody ever clicks on the button, run this function. And if anybody ever has the key press on the input, call this function. And now every time I click, this gets triggered and it goes over here, it says, hey, is the input length greater than 0? If it is, create a list element. And here it is. And if I ever have a key press, it checks to see if the input is greater than 0. Then I check to see if I press the enter key, and then I create list element. And this looks pretty clean, right? Anybody can come, and if they know a little bit of JavaScript, you can read what is happening just from the code. And that is something you really want to strive for, where you don't want to repeat yourself. You want to cache these queries so that we're not using up too much power for the browser. And we have everything broken down into functions that are very, very simple. Okay, that's it for now. Add any shopping list items you need, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.